Public opinion is obviously a subject of very high interest in a democracy. Any government based on popular sovereignty should concern itself with what the public thinks about important societal issues. But how do we assess what the public's opinion actually is? This is something that we've gotten much better at measuring in recent decades than in earlier eras of our history. The invention of the modern public opinion poll, also commonly known as the survey, has transformed the way we understand public opinion. But before we examine public opinion polls or surveys more closely, I do want to take a few moments to highlight some of the other ways that public opinion is assessed in the American political system. Decision makers utilize a variety of informal measures that are sometimes as important, if not more important, than survey data in guiding political decisions. For example, members of Congress closely monitor and tally emails and phone calls their offices receive from their constituents expressing support for or opposition to a particular piece of legislation the member will be voting on shortly. Administrative decision makers in the bureaucracy request comment letters from the public on proposed rules for carrying out legislation. For example, when the United States Department of Agriculture was designing rules about organic labeling standards to carry out the Organic Foods Production Act in the 1990s, the department originally drafted a rule that would have allowed irradiated and genetically modified foods to be sold as organic products. But during the public comment period, over 250,000 letters from concerned citizens came in urging the department to change the rule so that irradiated and genetically modified foods could not be labeled as organic. This was the biggest public response the Agriculture Department had ever received over a proposed rule, and they altered the final rule in line with the opinion of the public as expressed in those comment letters. Protests can also have a substantial impact on how decision makers assess public opinion. The photo on this slide is of protesters at a town hall meeting by Republican Congressman Tom MacArthur in early 2017, as he and fellow Republicans attempted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. This protest and many others like them were an early sign of public mobilization against the Republicans' health policy agenda and contributed to the defeat of Obamacare repeal later in the year. What all these informal measures mentioned in this slide do is they provide decision makers with a gauge on the intensity of public opinion on a particular issue. Generally speaking, if you as a citizen are fired up enough about something to contact your member of Congress, or write a letter to an executive branch agency, or engage in a protest, that probably means you have a very strong opinion about the issue you're speaking up on. And if you care that much about an issue, you'll likely base your vote on how your representatives acted in regards to that issue. So politicians take signs of intensely held public opinions very seriously. Okay, before we proceed, I'd like you to capture your understanding of the previous slide in your notes for your portfolio. So please take a few moments to answer the following questions. What are some informal measures of public opinion that public officials pay attention to? And why are these measures important to public officials? Your answers to these questions will help you to prepare for the next exam, and I will be reviewing your answers during the next portfolio check. While the informal measures we just covered are critically important for understanding certain elements of public opinion, the primary measure we use today to assess how the public views a particular issue or candidate is the public opinion poll, or survey. As your book describes, modern public opinion polling was created by George Gallup back in the 1930s. While informal surveys had been around for a long time, Gallup's innovation was to apply the principles of inferential statistics to the measurement of public opinion. I don't know how many of you have taken a stats class yet, but inferential statistics basically boils down to drawing conclusions, also known as inferences, about a whole population by surveying a relatively small sample of that population. For these statistical methods to be valid and yield accurate results, the key is that the sample has to be representative of the population as a whole. The best way to do this is through a random sampling method, in which each member of the population has an equal chance of being included in the sample. This is a little bit counterintuitive. How, for instance, if we wanted to know who's going to win a presidential election in which 140 million people are likely to cast ballots, how can we possibly estimate the candidate's likely percentage of the vote simply by asking a sample of 1,000 voters, which is about how many people are generally included in such surveys? At a gut level, that doesn't seem to make much sense. But let me try a couple analogies to help make sense of this. Imagine I pour out an impossibly massive jar of coins. Let's imagine it contains 1,000,000 coins. And I want you to tell me how many times heads would come up if you flipped each of those 1,000,000 coins one time. Now you could flip every one of those 1,000,000 coins and tally up the results. That would be incredibly time consuming. So instead, maybe you decide to flip 100 of these coins. Your results might be something like 52 heads and 48 tails. You could then infer that the likelihood of each coin flip coming up heads is 52%, plus or minus a certain margin of error. Depending upon how precise you need to be, this might be a sufficient answer. If you wanted to narrow down the error range a bit more, you might flip 1,000 coins instead of 100. That should give you a large enough sample of coin flips to make a pretty accurate conclusion about the likelihood of heads for your entire population of coins. The key here is that drawing conclusions about that whole stack of 1,000,000 coins from a relatively small sample is valid because the coins in the sample that you tossed are representative of the whole population of coins. There's nothing unique or different about those coins that you flipped that changes their likelihood of coming up heads. Okay, another analogy. Let's say you're getting a blood test to check your cholesterol level. A medical professional will draw a small vial of your blood to run this test. Fortunately, it isn't necessary to drain your entire supply of blood in order to run this test. Instead, that small vial that the medical professional draws, that'll do because the chemical composition of our blood is pretty uniform throughout our circulatory system. Therefore, the blood in that small vial is representative of our blood supply overall. The same principle applies to public opinion polling, although there are some added difficulties, as we will see. Let's talk about some of these difficulties by examining the Literary Digest poll of the 1936 presidential election described in your book. The Literary Digest had been polling presidential races for many years with a strong record of success, but their method led them badly astray in 1936. They sampled over 2 million people, asking them via a mail survey how they would vote in the upcoming election. You would think such a large sample would make a survey more accurate, but that just isn't the case. Instead, quality is far more important than quantity when drawing a sample from a larger population. In the case of the Literary Digest, their sample was drawn from telephone directories and vehicle registration lists. This introduced a large degree of sampling error or bias into the poll. Can you think of how this sampling method introduced error into the survey? Think again about representative sampling as being the cornerstone for modern polling. Were Americans who owned cars and had telephones in 1936 representative of the whole American population? Basically, no, they were not. At that time, wealthy and upper middle class people were far more likely to have these possessions than people without much money. And that was a particularly fatal flaw for a poll of the 1936 presidential election, because that race broke down largely along class lines, with the poor and working class far more supportive of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal programs than the wealthy, who tended to oppose FDR. So, because they were drawing from an unrepresentative sample, the Literary Digest was badly wrong in its prediction that Roosevelt's challenger, Alf Landon, would win the election. Okay, let's take a moment to pause again to capture some of what we've learned in our portfolios. So please answer the following questions. Describe the Literary Digest poll of the 1936 presidential election. How did they conduct the survey? What did their results tell them about who would win the upcoming election? And why were they so wrong about the actual result of the election? So you're very likely to find a short essay question like this on the next exam. But public opinion polls face challenges even beyond potential sources of sampling error. One of the big challenges that has become something of a crisis in recent years is the problem of non-response bias. Basically, this gets at the fact that no matter how much good, diligent work pollsters do to draw good, representative samples, they can't force the people included in those samples to participate in the survey. And this problem is starting to reach epic proportions. As this figure from the Pew Research Center shows, back in the late 1990s, the response rate for telephone surveys was 36%, meaning 36 out of every 100 people chosen in a sample actually responded to the survey. 36% isn't great. It still presents problems. But those problems are nothing compared with recent years in the cell phone era, in which only 9% respond to surveys. That's the response rate for all public opinion surveys in general. Response rates for election surveys are even worse. Polling organizations surveying about the 2018 congressional elections are encountering response rates between 1% and 5%. So what's the issue here? The problem lies if there are important differences between the folks who respond to surveys and the folks who don't. In election polling, for instance, are Democrats more likely to respond than Republicans? Are women more likely to respond than men? Are older people more likely to respond than young adults? If any of these things are true, and they often are, then the results of the survey will be biased and likely inaccurate. Pollsters try to solve this problem by weighting their samples. For instance, if they only get half as many young people to respond relative to their proportion in the sample, the pollster will give extra weight to the opinions of those young people who actually responded to the survey. But this is tricky because it means the pollster has to make certain assumptions that may not be true. For instance, that 18 to 29-year-olds who respond to public opinion surveys have basically the same opinions as 18 to 29-year-olds who don't respond to surveys. The lower the response rate goes, the more pollsters have to engage in these tricky adjustments that may or may not be sound. Let me show you how this works with an actual election poll. Here we have a poll of a congressional election, Texas's 23rd district in the House of Representatives for the 2018 election. The New York Times teamed up with Siena College to poll this race to see which candidate was likely to win. They drew a sample of the district using voter registration files. That's a very good practice if the population you're interested in is the voting public. From that sample, they spoke with 488 people. But they had to call nearly 39,000 people to reach 488 people willing to take the survey, a response rate of just over 1%. That's a huge challenge for getting a reliable result. As we dig down even deeper into the survey, we see additional problem areas. As the pollsters themselves describe in the text, people who respond to surveys are almost always too old, too white, too educated, and too politically engaged to accurately represent everyone. We can see this, for example, in the fact that only 5% of the people who responded to the survey were between the ages of 18 to 29, even though they made up 9% of the sample drawn by the pollsters. And non-white respondents accounted for 40% of the completed surveys, even though they were 50% of the original sample. This is a problem because young people and non-whites are politically distinct from the population as a whole. For instance, they tend to be more likely to vote for Democratic candidates. As the pollsters explain at the bottom of this figure, they compensate by giving more weight to the respondents from underrepresented groups. That's an appropriate strategy, but it's not without risks. For instance, look at the 18 to 29-year-old category again. Under the column labeled Interviewed, we see that the pollsters spoke with 22 individuals in that age grouping. Those 22 people essentially have to act as stand-ins for how young people throughout this congressional district intend to vote. That's problematic when you have such a small subgroup. What if by chance those 22 young people just happen to be more Republican-leaning than that age group generally is? If that's the case, then giving extra weighting to those 22 people's responses will just amplify the error in the poll. Also, how do we know whether 18 to 29-year-olds were less likely to take part in the survey because they don't like to take surveys, or whether it's because they don't take surveys because they don't intend to vote? In other words, how do we know what the percentage of 18 to 29-year-olds in the electorate will be? The short answer is we don't know. The pollster has to make a best guess based on past voting history. But what if this particular election gets young people particularly fired up to vote? If that's the case, young people's opinions will be underrepresented in this poll, even with additional weighting. None of this is meant as a criticism of this particular poll. The New York Times and Siena College are some of the best, most professional public opinion researchers out there, and they're very transparent about their methodology. Instead, it's meant to highlight the challenges of conducting an accurate, high-quality survey. I hope these slides have provided you with information you can use to be an informed consumer of public opinion surveys, which seem to be an ever-prevalent part of our media landscape. Okay, so just to finish up, let me alert you to what to pay particularly close attention to as you're doing this week's reading and preparing for the chapter quiz. The quiz will focus most heavily on section 6.2 of the chapter, how public opinion is measured. Make sure you understand the discussion in the reading, supplemented with my presentation that you've just listened to, about the methods pollsters use to try to achieve accurate polling. Also, please take the time to review the key terms and practice questions at the end of the chapter. And please let me know if you have any questions about the material.